Quick, one thing you remember, one thing that happened. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 33. One thing that happened. Just give me one thing real quick. Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. Okay, what about the dream? One thing about the dream. Bad news for him. He couldn't understand it. His wise men couldn't understand it. He turned to Daniel, and Daniel said, "This is not good. This is bad news for you." Daniel actually says, "I wish this was about your enemies and not you." We talked, you might remember, about how Daniel has some sort of affection for Nebuchadnezzar, and we struggle with that because Nebuchadnezzar was not a nice guy, generally speaking. He was pretty rough, but Daniel was serving him and trying to do a good job of that. And so that's kind of the way the story unfolds. Daniel says, I wish this were not about you, but it is. And the bad news is what, really briefly? What's the bad news? Characterize the bad news.
Be driven out of his kingdom.
Going to be driven out of his kingdom? He's going to live like an animal. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. You're going to live like a beast of the field, and that's exactly what took place. What was the circumstance when that actually took place? What was happening when that actually began? He was praising himself. Yeah, he was talking about how wonderful he was. Verse 30 says, the king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" We don't talk like that today, and even if we did, I would suggest that we shouldn't, because what happens next is, verse 31, while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, the Lord spoke from heaven and said, "Okay, king, what I said was going to happen to you is about to happen to you." And that's what happened to him. Sometimes we look at that and say, well, how in the world did all that work? You ever wonder how that worked? I think we introduced the idea last week of how did it begin? Literally, how did it physically begin? You're going to be driven from among the people, and you're going to end up eating out in the field. You get grass in the field. The dew of heaven's going to fall on you. How did that initially begin? I've always wondered that. I mean, somebody at some point had to take him from where he was to where he was going, or maybe he lost his mind and just went there himself. I don't know. But the physical nature of how it worked sometimes gets us stumped, and we focus on that, trying to figure out things that really we can't figure out, instead of saying, God's in charge. That's the point of it all. The creator of the world rules the world. Should be no great surprise to us. We sometimes forget that, though. And one of the reasons we forget it is because of a passage we might look at a little bit later. The world tends to just go on, and so we forget that God is still in control of it all. Sometimes we miss that. And how long did that happen? Remember we talked about it last week. How long was he in that circumstance?
Complete amount of time, such as
what did?
God designated.
All right, so how is it described in the text? 7 times or 7 periods of time. Yeah, and we talked about, is that weeks, months, years, whatever. More than likely not at all. It is probably a reference to when the time was right. How do we know when the time would be right? Is there anything that tells us that there would be a time that was right for it to come to an end? Yeah, the statement made to him was, God's going to do this to you until you realize that he rules. Until you realize it's not about you. That's how long it's going to take. And so that lends toward the complete concept. It lends toward until this time comes to pass, until this circumstance comes to pass. After class last week, Brother Bailey mentioned to me that this may be the first time in the text that we have some language that has to do with symbols and signs. What do we call that, by the way? What? I'm sorry? Say it again. Apocalyptic? Yeah, big word. The idea is it doesn't really mean 7 weeks or 7 years. It's referring to something else. But 7 has this concept of completeness along with it. And so you look at all that, and that's how long it took. It took that amount of time for Nebuchadnezzar to figure out what was going on. So that takes us down to about verse 34. It says in verse 34, but at the end of that period, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then here's the characterization of the Most High and him who lives forever. If you have your Bible open to Daniel chapter 4 and verse 34. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? Nebuchadnezzar sums him up. Is there some messianic statement in there at all?
Well, there certainly is from the kingdom and it being everlasting.
Yep, from the everlasting kingdom concept. You go back over to Daniel chapter 2, and there in verse 44, you have the idea of the kingdom that endures forever. And so Nebuchadnezzar here is affirming the very same thing that has already been stated that he probably didn't get and might not even get here. But in his paying homage to God, he refers to God in a very accurate way. The kingdom of God endures forever. Those who are His forever. That's how that works. And verse 35, He does according to His will regarding the world, the earth, and regarding what else? Not just the physical world and planets and all that, but what else? The people in it, the inhabitants of it. You think we need to be reminded of that from time to time? We need to remember that He is active in His creation, and you and I are a part of His creation. We are not like Him. He exists separate from His creation, so He can look at His creation from a perspective you and I cannot. Think about that. Think about God, and He's not a created being. He didn't come into being, but everything that He's made, He can see uniquely from a creator's perspective. You and I have never had that perspective. We can try to imagine His perspective on it. We can try to even live up to His perspective on it. But the truth is, we are a created part of His creation. And so our perspective is always going to be that. And that means it will never be His while we're on this earth. It can't be. Can we try to appreciate His? Yes, this helps. Things like this really help us. But the reason I think it's important for us to understand that we are not like Him and our perspective of life on earth isn't like His perspective is because it forces us to set ours aside and go with His. It forces us to say, okay, I think I know all this stuff, but I really don't know all that much compared to Him who created it and exists separate from it. That is a fairly deep thing for us to consider, but it helps ground us in being reliant on Him and His Word and not me and my reasoning. My reasoning is confined to the sphere of things created. His reasoning lives outside the sphere of things created. And so we have to go with His will on any matter, His judgment on any matter, because mine's clouded with my participation in all of this. Yes, sir. Can you think of another Jewish king? Other than Jewish. Dr. Bailey mentioned quietly Pharaoh. Could be that. Otherwise, probably not. There is no Assyrian king that he spent that much time with in the record. Yeah, but probably not that amount of time. Probably Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar would be in the lead, I would think. And you make a really valid point that God is working on Nebuchadnezzar. He has been working on him. And we sometimes try to figure out why that is. Was it his influence that he had over the kingdoms of the earth at that time? His influence was similar to Pharaoh's. Was it that similar to God's influence with Pharaoh, he wanted the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, to see his works and recognize him? You know, God wanted the Egyptians to understand who he was, whether Pharaoh did or not. Maybe that's a part of it. Maybe it's just merely the time that all of this is taking place and what God is trying to set before His people. They're going to come back to Jerusalem. Maybe He's working things from that direction. The end result is, I'm not real sure, but it is an amazing thing, the amount of time the Lord spends trying to get Nebuchadnezzar to see things correctly. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think you're right. Daniel even says, you are the head of gold. God has blessed you and given you this. It's a pretty striking thing. In conjunction with that, also remember that great king, Nebuchadnezzar, who had built some amazing things and through whom God was doing some things, he also died. His life came to an end, and that was that for him on earth. And that's just kind of how things go. However great and powerful we might become in our little part of the world, it's all going to go away anyway. That's how it is. And so were it not for Nebuchadnezzar being mentioned in the text, you and I probably wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on him. You ever thought about it like that? Were it not for the Pharaoh being mentioned in the text, we probably wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on Pharaoh. The significance they have, if they have any at all, is attached to the God who made them. And if we see our lives like that any significance I might have is attached to my relationship with God, then it simplifies life. It just makes things easier for us, helps us focus on the right thing a little bit easier. Anything else about 34 and 35? Yes, sir?
Along those lines, I think there's a really striking similarity, Todd, between the nation of Egypt and the role they played with 70 individuals that were accounted as God's people that started the process, if you will, of the 400 years that had been promised to Abraham in regards to a great nation developing within the borders of Egypt. And now you have probably, by most counts, what is it, around 50,000 or so that are exiled to Babylon. And out of both of those groups, God preserves his people, and they ultimately bring us to the Savior from a genetic standpoint.
They are the remnant.
There's a really strong connection
Yep.
between the way he used Egypt and now the way he's using the ruler of the two greatest nations in the world at that point in time as far as the Mediterranean basin goes. And I think there's a really striking similarity between both of those were used to bring us to the Savior.
Very good. Very good point. We make the point over and over again that rarely or ever, never is God doing just one thing at any given time. He is always dealing with his bigger, greater plans. And if you see yourself as a part of that and understand that you literally have a part to play in that, then it's helpful for us. Very good. Okay, verse 36, a little bit more commentary. He's already said he's going to say some things again. Verse 36, at that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. And my counselors, my nobles began seeking me out, so that I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. Daniel made it clear to Nebuchadnezzar that your problem is you're not allowing God to be God, you're wanting to be God. Made that real clear to him earlier. And here Nebuchadnezzar kind of owns up to that. And he says, he humbled me. He put me in my place. A lot of folks want to go on from there and say, okay, well then what did Nebuchadnezzar do and how does all that work? I don't have the answer to that. I don't need the answer to that. The idea is God humbled him and Nebuchadnezzar realized that God had humbled him, and that's a marvelous thing. Would that we come to a point of humility before we have to suffer the way he did and go through the things he did. Much like, again, Pharaoh. Had Pharaoh humbled himself before God, all of Egypt would have been better off. Everything would have been better, but he wasn't going to do it. God knew he wasn't going to do it, and so God used that. And by requiring something of Pharaoh that he wasn't willing to give, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, let's look at 3 New Testament references, if we have the time, 3 New Testament references that kind of fit into this story about Nebuchadnezzar and his attitude and the way things went. The first one we'll go to is in Luke chapter 12. Turn over to Luke chapter 12. That's the first one we'll go to. Luke chapter 12 for the first one. This one just kind of sets the stage with a story that has a little bit of some similarities. Beginning in verse 13, Jesus is teaching, and someone says, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me, and Jesus responds to that. And then verse 16, he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So why turn to this one? What's the significance, or what's the catch with this one and Nebuchadnezzar? What are the similarities? Yes, ma'am.
Thinking of himself and wanting his eyes.
There you go. I have created a circumstance and I am going to enjoy the circumstance. They're looking at life and specifically their immediate arrangement from two main reasons. One is only what do I want, and I created all this to begin with. I put myself in this position to begin with. They have those things in common, it appears. And so we understand how God viewed Nebuchadnezzar when he did that. How does God deal with this fellow? Pretty well the same way, isn't it? Pretty well the same way. When I'll say to my soul, soul, you've done well. You've arranged a really good situation. I have created a marvelous arrangement for myself. And verse 20, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now, who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. Nebuchadnezzar's view of life was all about Nebuchadnezzar. It just was. And like we said last week, if you're the king, if you're the most powerful fellow in the whole region, I could see where that would be the temptation. And then we go to today and we realize that each of us is kind of powerful regarding our own circumstance. And we get to choose what we're going to do and when we're going to do it and how we're going to do it and the attitude with which we do it. We're not all that different in some ways from Nebuchadnezzar. So the question is, when we come to the New Testament, is our attitude different from his or from this fellow's? Jesus tells the parable to try to get us to say, okay, how does that fit with me? Am I someone who looks at my life and says, well, look at what I've done. I have arranged some really good things for myself, and I think I'm just going to enjoy what I like. The two problems exist for us if we have that attitude. We're just thinking of self and what pleases self, and we're giving self credit for something self really isn't responsible for. So if God put Nebuchadnezzar where he was, and Daniel says that he did, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually says that he did, who put you where you are? If you are in any kind of a good circumstance, how did you get there? Let's not act like the Lord didn't have anything to do with that. We know that he did. And so what are you going to do? Look inward and satisfy self, or are we going to look outward and try to help others? That's really the lesson that we're after. And it's pretty plain here. This one has the money aspect of it, the riches aspect of it. There's a connection between riches and arrogance. There's a connection between riches and self-reliance. There's a connection there. And we have to fight against that. And so this fellow did not do that. Another reference is Acts chapter 12. Go to Acts 12 with me, please. Acts chapter 12. This one has some similarities as well. Acts chapter 12, you remember that Peter is arrested. He is going to be, it is planned that he be killed, just like James, the brother of John, had been killed. But he is rescued. And after that, verse 20 of Acts 12, talking about Herod. Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace, because their country was fed by the king's country. So a little commentary on the backstory is what that is. Now verse 21, here's what's really happening with Herod. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And the people kept crying out, the voice of a God and not of a man. And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and died. I've always read that the way it reads and wished kind of down deep that it was flipped, that he died and was eaten by worms. The first one sounds really, really bad. It's just not something I want at all. So anyway, that happened to Herod. And why did that happen to Herod?
Well, it tells us because he didn't give God the glory. That's verse 23.
Is it similar to Nebuchadnezzar? Does it have some similarities? Sounds like there's a similarity, yeah. So would you agree that if we're not careful, we can run the risk when things are going well? We can run the risk of wanting to take the credit for the things that are going well and not give God the credit for the things that are going well. A lot of times when things aren't going well, we're looking for what? Looking for help? Looking for what else? I'm sorry? For God to help us? What else? Looking to blame somebody. Who's responsible for this and what's God going to do about it? That's kind of how we got. I know that's a rather harsh way of saying it, but a lot of times that's where we are. Things are not the way I want them to be. Things are bad. So who caused it and what's God going to do about it? We tend to go there if we're not careful quickly. When things are good, sometimes our tendency, if we don't fight against it, is to say, boy, I've done some good stuff, haven't I? And I think I'm just going to enjoy my stuff. And so you have Herod here on his rostrum, seated up there on his throne, if you will. And the people are saying it's the voice of a God and not of a man. Do you think the people really believe that? Is that what they're saying? Do they really think it's the voice of a God? But you get the backstory. What are they doing? It's flattery. Yeah, he feeds us, and so we're going to be real nice to him, and we're going to say really neat things to him. How might he have avoided this problem, Herod, of being eaten by worms and dying? Yeah. That's not what we're going to do. That's not what we're going to do. We're not going to talk like that. Well, that's a good one for us to consider as well. Verse 24, by the way, fits into that. When this happens, when Herod is struck dead by an angel of the Lord, it says in verse 24, the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. That didn't slow down the gospel one bit. There are times, in fact, where people need to get out of the way and let the gospel do its thing, and this may have been one of those times. Herod had put James to death. He arrested Peter, intending to kill him. God rescued Peter, but interestingly enough, when we talked about this last year, God chose not to rescue James, but he did rescue Peter. And sometimes the evil forces are just taken out of the way where the gospel can do its thing. That's part of what goes on here. So one more reference that we'll go to, and it's one you're very familiar with. Turn with me over to James chapter 4, and we'll kind of wrap things up here in James chapter 4. Maybe spend a little bit more time here. James chapter 4. This kind of helps bring these concepts right down to a very practical level for us in James 4, because most of us don't wander out on our balcony at night and survey our kingdom and say to ourselves, you have really done great. Just look at how much you've accomplished. Most of us don't do that. But we still struggle with some things, and things that maybe would indicate that we take more credit for what goes on than we give to God. And James gets to that in James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. So look at it with me in your New Testament. James 4:13. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. And stop right there. The New American Standard says, come now. What other do you have? What other version do you have? Anybody say anything other than come now? What's that? Go to now. Okay. So what he's saying is, think about this for a minute. Have you ever thought this? Have you ever said this? Have you ever had this attitude? That's what James is saying. Think about this. Consider this for a minute. You who say today or tomorrow, here's what we're going to do. How many of you have said today or tomorrow, here's what we're going to do? How many of you have said that? Anybody? Anybody done that? Every day. Yeah, I've told you before, I like to have a plan. You know, I like to have a plan. And the little electronic devices are a great place to put your plan. You wake up in the morning, you can see your plan, you can modify your plan, you can add things to your plan, you can take things off your plan, you got a plan. Every day. It's not complete, and it will change, and it will be interrupted, and things will be different, but it's a plan. Every day of here's what we're going to do. At least these things, here's what we're going to do. Do we know we're actually going to do those things? We do not. And that's where James is going. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Here's what we're going to do. We've got big plans. Is there anything wrong with plans? Not a bit. Not a bit. Verse 14, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. I thought it would be good for us to kick that concept around just a little bit. You do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. Anybody have an example, a recent example of not knowing what your life will be like tomorrow? In other words, something happened that you could not have anticipated, did not anticipate, and yet there you were. Anybody have an example of that? 2005. What happened in 2005? Your dental office caught on fire while you were at my house in 2005. We were not sitting around there thinking, wonder if anything's on fire in Waldron. We weren't thinking about that at all. And yet, there you go. And it's one of those things that you can't just brush aside and say, well, that wasn't a big deal. I mean, oh, we can handle that. That's no problem. No, that's one of those things that it's you can't undo it. It's a big deal. Well, you never see it coming. Anybody have anything else? The COVID mess was like that for a lot of us, and a lot of us it was like that over and over and over again. I remember thinking, oh, well, we're going to have to take a few days and do a little something. And then high school athletics were called off, and I'm like, whoa, are we sure about that? And then what was the big thing going on in March that was called off? The basketball tournament. Are you serious? I did not see that coming. And then over and over and over. We actually got fairly good at predicting some things, but only because we could understand behavior of people, not because we had any control over what was really going on. Everything changed, and we did not see that coming. What else? Look back at it. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. Give me something else.
I was thinking about 9/11. Thousands of people worked that morning,
left the house that morning, did what they always did, what they were supposed to do. And everything was different. Yeah. Can you imagine that? Nobody saw anything like that. Did we know that we lived back then and even now in a land that sometimes terrorists want to target? Are we aware of that? Yeah. You watch a little bit of news, you can be aware of that. Do we wake up every day anticipating that sort of thing? We do not. Do you want to? We do not. No. You have any control over it at all? I think we learned. We do not. And so we go about and do our business. But the point James made almost 2,000 years ago by inspiration is a point that you and I still live today. You do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. And because that is true, we should defer to the one who does. There is only one who does. And we are not it. And so that, just from a very practical, logical standpoint, argues in favor of deferring to God. That's one of the reasons why I struggle so much when people say, I don't believe in God. I really struggle with that because, honestly, I don't believe that. I think everybody believes in something because everybody is confronted with, I don't know. Everybody is. And you can use a lot of fancy words and sentences and paragraphs, but at the end of the day, what James said is absolutely true, and you don't know. And you have been surprised over and over and over again, and you have been caught unawares over and over and over again. And if that's not saying to you, you don't know, I don't know what else is. And so James says, you don't know what it's going to be tomorrow, and then he follows it up with, you're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. That used to hurt my feelings. It did. It's just kind of a downer, you know. Oh, man. But then you look at it from the other side and you kind of get excited about things. What I mean by that is, whatever it is you're dealing with right now, whatever it is that is not good, that's challenging, that's disappointing, whatever it is, it won't last. And one of the ways I absolutely know it won't last is because you and I aren't going to last. We act like 100 years is a long time. We act like it is. It's really not. And what James is getting at is you're a vapor that appears for a little while. Have you ever really watched a vapor, like some steam coming up off of some water that's boiling? It doesn't all go to the same place at the same time. You ever notice that? It doesn't all go right up at the very same time the same way. It just kind of floats out. That's how we are. We're all a part of this vapor concept, and we're just there. And then we're not going to be there. And that's yelling at us to live in view of the one who's not a vapor, the one who is eternal. James says, you're just a vapor. Some of your versions will say, your life is. God isn't. Think about the opposite. Think about God here. He says, you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. God does. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while, then it vanishes away on earth. But God isn't like that. And so we see our earthly lives more clearly when we understand who God is and what we're involved in. And all this stuff in life, it's not really that big a deal. I've said I don't know how many times, it won't matter in 100 years. And I don't say it flippantly, I say it mainly to remind myself that whatever it is won't matter in 100 years. The only thing that will matter is, are we faithful to the Lord? That's it. The things that are so important to us won't matter. It just won't amount to anything. You ever wondered about Nebuchadnezzar and what he really wanted to accomplish? I mean, you see him up there walking around his palace, and you kind of get the sense that he had arrived. But you know, most folks who had arrived to the degree he had, they want what? Something else. Yeah, we want something else. He had plans too. There were things he wanted to accomplish also, and he didn't get to do it. There was a point at which it stopped. And I think it's good for us to consider what James is saying here. You don't know. You're just here for a little while, and then you vanish away. And so, verse 15, the answer to that is not sit in despair and be mad about it. The answer is, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. So is it okay to say, Lord willing? Is it biblical to say, Lord willing? Yeah. Can it become a habit that you don't mean? Yeah. So could anything else. That doesn't argue that it's not a good thing to do. We just have to be diligent about that. Learn to think and feel that. Learn to express from within, I'm living on God's time, not mine. It is His life that He has given me, and I'm going to use it for His cause. It reminds me of what Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. You've been bought with a price, he says. Therefore what? You've been bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body. He has given you time. Use it for His cause. The last part of that, James says, but as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. When we say, I know what's going on and I'm in charge, we're arrogantly boasting. Having options in life sometimes leads us down that road. When we get to thinking we're in charge, kind of takes us in that direction. So we don't want to do that. Back over to Nebuchadnezzar. He wraps things up, Nebuchadnezzar does, wraps it all up by saying, verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all His works are true, and His ways are just, and He is able to humble those who walk in pride. Let's just make it about Him. If we do that, we'll be all right. Thank you for participating. Lord willing, next week we'll start with Belshazzar in chapter 5. We'll kind of switch gears. So next week.